It's a privilege for me to introduce an outstanding bishop of California. Bishop Robert McElroy is a native of San Francisco. Hello, yes. He was educated at Stanford University, then at the North American College in Rome, where he did a doctorate in moral theology, and also studied at, did I say, what was the other one? Harvard at the beginning. And then at Stanford, he studied political science, which I think is a great mixture, much needed in our time. His dissertations were on American public theology and morality and American foreign policy. I hope you have had the chance to read some of his articles in America Magazine, because, as well, where he expanded critical current moral issues, the primary issues that Pope Francis has wanted us to see together with life issues, biotechnical issues, the larger span that included poverty and justice. He has, in addition, had great amount of pastoral experience. And I observed him in the East Bay when he was part of the process of working for workers' rights and unions in hotels. He was particularly eloquent a year ago at a conference in Modesto, California. It was a gathering, United States Regional World Meeting of Popular Movements. In a time of political and social upheaval and disruption, he said, we must disrupt those who deport people and rip mothers and fathers from their families. That was a prophetic cry, especially needed today in our country. So I introduce to you a truly Vatican II and Francis Bishop, Bishop Bob McElroy of San Diego.
It's great to be here with you today. I was first introduced to the association by Archbishop John Quinn, who was a great leader in the life of the church. He ordained both me and Archbishop Preston. I know some years ago Jim had talked with Archbishop Quinn about the association, and he was very positive about it. He was the one who introduced both John and me to the association. And it's a great joy to be here and to listen as all the thanksgiving went up for the years of service in the life of priesthood and dedication to God and to the church. And in some ways, I can't help but think that it's a particularly important moment in all of those years of service. This moment and the witness of this group is a particularly important witness, both within our society as a whole and within the internal life of the church. And so I encourage you in that. Last weekend, I was part of a interfaith group, interfaith clergy leadership, that marched on the detention center at Otay Mesa, which is right at the border in San Diego. And it's a prison. And as we did so, we were chanting in the street, you know, and as we came to the point of the prison, with you can't see anything of their chain link fences, and then there's the concrete of the prison. But it was interesting as we were chanting, all of a sudden somebody said, they can hear us. And we were chanting, we love you, don't lose hope, God is with you. And so we went silent, and they were chanting back to us. It was a very moving moment, because you understood that reciprocity of our humanity. And it was a very sobering moment, but it was a beautiful moment. And I couldn't help but think, in that day as we were marching, and I shared with the people there, the Gospel of Matthew tells us that the Holy Family fled into Egypt as refugees, fleeing the oppression and the murderous outbreak of Herod's anger. And I couldn't help but think that the Holy Family had come to our border during the past weeks, that the child Jesus would have been ripped from the arms of the Blessed Mother and put into a cage. For us as Christians, that is a terrible reality. For us as Americans who love our country, that is a terrible reality. And I am pleased by the level of outrage that has risen up on this issue. And that has been a good moment for us, I think, as a country, where we really look, our soul is at stake here as a country. Really, not only our notion of who we are, but the reality of who we are as a people is in jeopardy here. And so I think we took a step back from that, but the problem was we don't know how to move forward now in our society. So I encourage you, and I'm glad to see the resolutions you'll be working on and the commitments you'll be making in this whole area, because it is absolutely essential that the church be a strong and powerful and prophetic voice at this moment in our nation's history, and a moral voice. These issues we're dealing with are moral questions, fundamentally. It is a complex issue how we work out immigration, and our nation has a right and a duty to secure its borders. That's all true. But it is an inherently, deeply, and profoundly a moral question, how we do it. And it is even more a moral challenge to us to make sure that every step we take doesn't engage in cruelty and dehumanization. So I thank you for your solidarity with that. I think that's one of the most important elements of this association, is a continuing witness, not only as a body, but in your individual ministries and those whom you serve and those whom you encounter and have relationships with, to bring this understanding of the moral depth of what we are facing as a nation and how we must preserve our soul and reorient our moral compass to understand that God is the author of the human family, which includes all of us, and that is a reality which must be in the depths of our hearts and souls. Every day I see our people in San Diego, the undocumented, and the harshness that this new reality has brought to them. People often don't understand that in the United States there are two jurisdictions on immigration. One is ICE. ICE has the whole country. It's the Immigration Service. And there's certain rules that they have and certain priorities they have. But within 100 miles of the border, there's a whole different jurisdiction that's the Border Patrol. And they have the right to make searches and apprehend people far beyond what ICE does. And they exert those rights. And so the people who live within our area have border checkpoints that they cannot go beyond. I remember when I first got to San Diego, we had a religious education conference, we still do, once a year, for our catechists and for liturgists, for a variety of people. And it was good. But I said afterwards to our staff, I said, why do we bother to have one when Los Angeles has probably the best in the country, right? Why don't we send our people there? And they said to me, the checkpoint. There's a checkpoint. There are checkpoints around our diocese. You can't go north without hitting a checkpoint. And that's when it dawned on me. For the undocumented in our area, they live in a large, but still within a prison. They can't go beyond. They can't visit relatives beyond. It's too risky. And unfortunately, every once in a while, people take the risk and then they get apprehended. We had a situation just about a year ago. It was a tragic one at a place called Hamul, where there's a checkpoint. And a young woman who goes to Berkeley was there. Her boyfriend goes to Berkeley. He was undocumented, so he was visiting. And they were traveling. They took a wrong turn coming back. He got caught and was deported. So this is the reality we're living in. I just urge you, please do what you can. And the most important witness I think you can bring is to help people understand this is a spiritual, moral issue. And it really goes to the heart of who our nation is going to be in the coming decade. Now, that's a challenge to us. But I want to talk today primarily about something that's a great treasure for us, and that's pastoral theology and the work of pastoral theology that I think is emerging in the heart of the life of Pope Francis. I like to go to movies. There's a beautiful movie that I saw some years ago about the terror in Rwanda. And it takes place in the capital, in a school, the Catholic school, that was a technical school to educate young people in technical skills. And it had a huge campus within the middle of the city. And so the movie is largely a portrayal of the relationship between two very different people. One is, it's based on a true story, Father Jan Kurek, who was a Franciscan priest. He was Croatian, and he'd been in Alaska for, in Rwanda for 3 decades, and he had come there filled with enthusiasm, filled with all the energy of the young priesthood. When we were all starting out and had all the answers in those times. And he had come to Africa with that and fallen in love with Africa and given his life over to the service of Africa. And over the years, he learned how to do his ministry better on certain ways. But as he comes into the time when this movie is taking place, he has grown tired and worn in service to God and the church and the people at the school. He's the headmaster at the school. And you can see on his face is etched the sadness he has seen and also just tiredness. And the counterpoint to Father Jan in this film is a young English student who has come. He's just finished college, Joe O'Connell, and he's filled with all that joy and energy. He's come to give a year or two of his life in Africa in a very idealistic way. In a way, a surface idealism, but a genuine one. And so he has completely fallen in love with Africa, with its people, with its culture, with its customs. And he's overwhelmed with all of the rapture that he sees around him and all that they are doing in the school and all that they are helping the students and the families of those students. And so for much of the film, it is a discussion between those two individuals about life and God and the work of God and plan of God in life and how you should spend your life. And then comes the moment of the terrible massacres in Rwanda. And as they broke out, and as we know, 800,000 people were killed while the West basically stood by and did nothing. The UN took over the school as its headquarters, stationed its troops there. And after they did that, the school families and their parents and their relatives came to the gate and asked, will you give us protection? And the UN said no. And Father Jan said, well, it's still my school, you let him in. So they let him in. And there were about 2,000 people in the compound as the weeks went on with the massacres outside. And during that period of time, everything changes for Father Jan. He has to do things that he never dreamt he could do. He has to keep the community together. He has to deal with the UN. He has to celebrate the sacraments. He's celebrating funerals and baptisms, first communions, marriages, all during this time. He has to take the truck every day to get medicine because he's the only one who can get in and out of the compound with any safety at all. So he takes this big truck and he goes and gets the medicines and brings them back. He's trying to keep the whole place going. And he's working with basically no sleep. And he is renewed in that. And so there comes a time when the UN decides that it's going to pull out. And so they say to the Europeans can come, people from other African countries can come, but no Rwandan can come with us. And Father Jan protests, but it does no good. And so Father Jan says to Joe, you have to get on the truck and go. And Joe is brokenhearted. He's crying. He says, I want to stay with these people. I love them so much. And Father Jan says to him, but you've got to go. It will do you no good to stay here. Go to the West. Talk to the people that you know there. Tell them what you have witnessed and what you have seen. But go and save your life here. You have much to give to this world. And Joe says, I want to stay, but I'm afraid to die. And so Father Jan leads him onto the bus, the truck, puts him on, and then turns to go. And Joe says to him, well, where are you going? And he said, well, I'm staying. And Joe says, but you just told me all the reasons why we have to go. He said, no, I told you the reason you have to go. I have to stay. And Joe says to him, why do you have to stay? And he said, because in these weeks, celebrating the sacraments, caring for the families, getting food and medicine for them in this terrible time of need, in these weeks, I have seen the face of the suffering Jesus Christ, lovingly embracing his people in a way I have never felt before. And I'm afraid that if I leave now in their need, I will never feel that same overpowering love of Christ again. And that is why you must go, but I must stay. And Joe goes, and Father Couric stays, and later he's killed for his work. This is the pastoral imperative for which all of us were ordained. To see the overpowering love of Jesus Christ with his people, embracing them in their moments of suffering, to witness to that in the sacramental life of the church, in our consolation of them, in our preaching of the gospel, in our unity and accompaniment. This is why we become priests. And this is the heart of the pastoral moment which we are in the church at this time. It is a pastoral moment which has been launched by Pope Francis, and it is a pastoral moment which is gaining momentum and should give us great joy that we are living at this time in the life of the church in which this pastoral call is unfolding with a new depth and a new beauty and a new vitality that all of us are part of. And that's what I want to talk to you about today. We are living in a wonderful moment in the life of the church. The authentic renewal of the Second Vatican Council remains the foundation and the challenge of those who seek to deepen the theology of the church and bring it into the life of the world. The call of Pope John Paul II for the church to constantly witness to Christ, and the challenge of Pope Benedict to confirm the truth in an age of relativism guide the Catholic community in its discernment and action. The call of missionary discipleship frames the vocation for every Christian woman and man. And the depth and mystery of God's continuing presence in all of the created order assures humanity that the final note of our existence is not pain, suffering, and despair, but is the fullness of joy and peace which lies in the love of a God who has brought to us every blessing which we know in this world and in the next. We are privileged to witness this moment in the life of the church and to recognize that it is a moment of explicit theological renewal that will contribute enormously to the spread of the gospel in this new millennium. For we are seeing an emerging pastoral theology at the very heart of the life of the church, which both links us to the pastoral actions and ethos of the Lord himself, and yet is highly attuned to the challenges and cultures of the 21st century. This pastoral theology calls for pastoral action to take its rightful place in framing the life and the belief of the universal church in concert with the traditional theological enterprises of dogma, scriptural studies, moral theology, ecclesiology, liturgical and spiritual theology. Indeed, the emergence of this pastoral theology in these last 5 years bears striking resemblance to the renewal of theology in the years which preceded the Second Vatican Council. During the post-war period, the growth of scripture studies informed by historical critical method, the recovery of the liturgical life of the church as a font for deepening our contemporary sacramental celebrations, and the sustained reflection on the nature of the church itself were part of a broad theological inquiry that allowed the bishops of the Second Vatican Council to reflect upon the challenge of the church in the modern world, armed with robust insights central to the proclamation of the gospel in the 20th century. Similarly, the growth of a comprehensive pastoral theology that we are witnessing today echoes the flourishing of ecumenical and moral theology in the post-conciliar period, and the continuing expansion of the church's social doctrine formed within a truly global church. These were moments of intense theological richness for the Catholic community in the 20th century, and continued to yield crucial insights about the fullness of salvation which has been bestowed upon us by Jesus Christ. But in a very real way, the pastoral moment that we are living through now in the life of the church is different from many of those prior theological renewals, for each of them took place within a recognized field of specifically theological reflection. The challenge of pastoral theology is not only to delineate the substance of its insights and the gospel of the life of the church, but also the challenge for pastoral theology to demonstrate that it is a significant branch of theology at all. For most of the history of the church, pastoral theology did not exist as a distinct branch of theology. There were splendid pastoral teachings in the Catholic tradition in every age, of course, but these writings were not considered a distinct branch of theology. It was only in the period after the Reformation at Trent that a specific Catholic pastoral theology emerged as a major element of the reform of the priesthood and ecclesial life. But the nature of even this post-Reformation pastoral theology was very, very limited. It was to a significant degree a derivative branch of theology, confined to the applications of the fruit of the branches of theology to the practice of the salvation of souls. Moreover, pastoral theology was envisioned as primarily the work of priests alone. It was also instrumental in nature. In his teachings, Pope Francis points to the understanding of pastoral theology, which is far more robust and riveting. This pastoral outlook demands that all of the other branches of theology attend to the concrete reality of human life and human suffering in a much more substantial way, informing doctrine. It states that the lived experience of human sinfulness and human conversion are vital to understanding the central attribute of God in relation to us, which is mercy. It demands that moral theology proceed from the actual pastoral action of Jesus Christ, which does not first demand a change of life, but begins with an embrace of divine love, proceeds to the action of healing, and only then requires a change of life. The pastoral theology of Pope Francis requires that the liturgical and sacramental life of the Church be formed in compassionate embrace with the often overwhelming life challenges which prevent men and women at periods in their life from conforming adequately to important gospel challenges. And the pastoral theology of Pope Francis rejects a notion of law which can be blind to the uniqueness of concrete human situations, human suffering, and human limitation. In these enormously important ways, the vision of pastoral theology embraced by Pope Francis is a rejection of the tradition which sees pastoral theology as primarily derivative and the application of other branches of theology. Rather, the use of pastoral theology in the teachings of Pope Francis points to an interactive role between pastoral theology and the historic disciplines of the Catholic theological tradition. In this way, pastoral realities are a significant font for theological reflection and development in all areas of doctrinal life. Just as importantly, the pastoral theology of Pope Francis rejects the traditional prism which focused pastoral theology on the work of priests, or even on a more generalized notion of pastoral ministry in the internal life of the Church. In a very real way, the architects of pastoral theology in the writings of Pope Francis include the whole body of the faithful in relationship with God. And the datum of pastoral theology is the lived experience of the faithful in the concrete call of their discipleship. There are three fundamental foundations for this pastoral theology. The first foundation is the assertion that not only the activity, but the very nature of the church itself involves at its heart pastoral action to heal the hearts of women and men who are suffering. Pope Francis outlined this ecclesiological assertion in his beautiful description of the church itself as a field hospital. I see clearly that the church needs most today is the ability to heal wounds and to warm the hearts of the faithful. It needs nearness, proximity. I see the church as a field hospital after battle. It is useless to ask a seriously injured person if he has high cholesterol and about the level of his blood sugars. You have to heal his wounds. Then we can talk about everything else. Heal the wounds, and you have to start from the ground up. This is the mission of the church. It heals, it cures. The mission of the church is to heal the wounds of the heart, to open doors to free people, to say that God is good, God forgives, God is the Father of all. You know, when we talk about this image of a field hospital, what Pope Francis is talking about is quite different than the highly technical and antiseptic field hospitals, thank God, our troops have in the field. You know, they're wonderful ways of carrying out medicine. That's not what he's talking about. What he's really talking about, I think, is this. Do you remember in the movie Gone with the Wind? In Gone with the Wind, there's that great scene where Scarlett O'Hara is going out to get a find a doctor to bring for her sister-in-law who's having a baby. And she comes out on the streets of Atlanta just as the wounded have come in. And it pans on, the screen pans on some soldiers, and they're crying out, and they're wounded, and there's blood everywhere, and it's gory, and they're crying out in pain, and there's no one there to help them. And then gradually the camera pulls back, and you see in that scene the field hospital is that whole long, becomes first 10, then 100, then 1,000, then 10,000 people lying there. That's the field hospital Pope Francis is talking about, I think, because the field hospital is all of us. One of the most beautiful elements of the Second Vatican Council was its magnificent theological images of the Church. The Church is the salvific sacrament of Christ's unity and mission. The Church is the pilgrim people of God journeying together in this earthly life. The Church is the mystical body with its complementarity among members and its headship in Christ. Each of these images conveys powerfully key elements of the sacred identity and ministry of the community which Jesus founded to sanctify the world. So too, the image of the Church as a field hospital stands as a powerful testimony to the nature and role of the community of faith in the world. It speaks to the centrality of God's action in the life of the Church, an action which begins as Jesus did by healing women and men in their brokenness, thus opening them to receiving the grace of God in their hearts, even as that grace is made manifest. The image of the Church as a field hospital points to the reality that the Church is never remote from the human experience, never self-reverential if it is to be faithful to its mission. Rather, the Church must always be enmeshed in the real lives and sufferings and challenges and joys of the people of God and the whole of humanity. The image of the pilgrim people of God in the Council emphasized the common journey and grace of those in the Church. The image of the Church as sacrament emphasized the nature of the Church as a reflection of the transforming power of God in the world. The image of the mystical body emphasized the complementarity of all within the life of the Church and the subjection of all to the person of Jesus Christ. The image of the field hospital emphasizes the explicitly pastoral identity of the Church, reaching into the lives of men and women precisely in their great suffering to reveal the multiple dimensions of the saving love that comes from God to them in their lives. The image of the Church as a field hospital has none of the elegance or beauty of the image of the mystical body or the Church's sacrament. The image of the field hospital is earthy, rough-hewn, much like the stable in Bethlehem where our Lord revealed himself to the world. Most importantly, the image of the Church as a field hospital testifies vividly to the pastoral dimension that lies at the heart of the Church's identity and its mission in the world. The second foundation for pastoral theology that Pope Francis is pointing to lies in the recognition that the Church should mirror the pastoral action of Jesus himself. It is the pattern of Jesus Christ, who walked the earth, which we are called to incorporate into every element of ecclesial life. This enduring truth is the foundation for a series of pastoral imperatives that Pope Francis has presented to the Church during the last 5 years. One of the most important of these imperatives is the call to accompaniment. In The Joy of the Gospel, Pope Francis beautifully expresses both the depth of the commitment and openness that must suffuse pastoral life and action in the Church. We will have to initiate everyone, he said, priests, religious, and laity, into this art of accompaniment, which teaches us to remove our sandals before the sacred ground of the other. When the Lord encountered Zacchaeus in the tree, he was encountering a man despised for his theft and victimization of others. But Christ's piercing, compassionate embrace, conveyed in the call to eat at the house of this sinner, was sufficient to transform the heart and soul of such a man. In patterning the Church's life after the ministry of Jesus Christ, The starting point is the drive to see and treat every human person as God sees them, an incredibly precious soul, individual in nature and identity, yet equally treasured by the Lord. The second pastoral imperative of the pastoral theology of Pope Francis urges us to model our action in the life of the church on the three steps that formed Jesus' encountered with those who were suffering or estranged in the gospel. First, the Lord embraces the person. Then he heals them, and then he calls them to reform. Each of these elements of the saving encounter with the Lord is essential, but their order is also essential. Christ first reveals the overwhelmingly merciful and limitless love of God. That's the first step. Then he moves to heal the particular form of suffering that the person is experiencing. And only then does he call the person specifically to a change in their life. This pattern must become ever more deeply the model for the church's proclamation of the faith and healing action in the world. This must be the imitatio Christi for a pastoral church in an age that rejects formalism, authority, and tradition. The call to change one's life to conform more fully with the gospel is essential to Christian conversion and the achievement of true happiness in this world and in the next. But that call must be encased in the tender, healing face of a church, which ministers as Christ did in order to take root in the present age. As a consequence, the pastoral church must be a non-judgmental church. There is no sin which Jesus mentions more frequently in the gospel than the sin of judgmentalism. For it is a sin so easy for us all in our humanity to fall into. It is a mystery of the human soul why men and women feel better about themselves when they can point to the faults of others. It is a mystery, but it is also a reality, both for our humanity and for the life of the church. Thus, we must imitate Christ, who consistently spoke of the standards of the gospel without compromise, but did not reject men and women for their inability to live the fullness of the gospel. We must banish judgmentalism for the life of the church and replace it with the constantly affirming love of Jesus Christ. And in doing so, we will become the truly inclusive community that the church, both by its charter and its intrinsic mission, was always called to be. The final foundation for the pastoral theology that Pope Francis is delineating for the life of the church is the assertion that the church's pastoral identity and action must be rooted in the life situations that men and women actually experience in the world today. It is impossible to build up a pastoral church without explicitly investigating the signs of the times and then integrating the results of that investigation into the core of the very church's mission. Thus, it is essential that pastoral theology be explicitly and thoroughly inductive in its method. The Church of Latin America has contributed enormously to this dimension of the church's life by its adoption of the See, Judge, Act methodology as a pathway for understanding every element of the life and the work of the church in the world. This method is rooted in the world as it is, rather than in the world as it imagined to be. The See, Judge, Act methodology begins theological reflection with the reality that confronts us, then ponders the implications of that reality for faith in the gospel, and finally promotes action in concert with those applications. As the final document of the Latin American bishops at Aparecida states, quote, "This method enables us to combine successfully a faithful perspective for viewing reality, incorporating criteria from faith and reason for discerning and appraising it critically, and accordingly acting as missionary disciples of Jesus Christ." It is this commitment to the inductive method, informed by faith and theological reflection, that was at the heart of Amoris Laetitia and Laudato Si. The lived reality of men and women and children and families was the starting point for the church's reflection on marriage and family life, not merely for the application point for pre-made theological reflections. Similarly, the degradation of the planet, which undermines so many elements of human dignity and the future of the earth itself, was the starting point for a Catholic theology of the environment, not merely an insertion point for the rich Catholic theology of creation. It is through the inductive pathway that the whole of the Catholic community becomes, in an active sense, architects of pastoral theology. For the spirit of pastoral theology is the very encounter of God with men and women in their ordinary lives, their dreams and hopes, their sufferings and wounds, their joys and accomplishments. Pastoral theology seeks to recapitulate and replicate the saving encounter of Jesus Christ with the saint and the sinner that resides in every human soul, touching every dimension of human existence in this real world. We are privileged to be living at this, the pastoral moment in the history of the modern church. We are gifted with the image of the church as a field hospital, focused precisely on the specific wounds that weigh down men and women of our age as well as ourselves. We are called in our identity as priests of the church and disciples of Jesus Christ to form an ecclesial community patterned on the pastoral action of our Lord and Savior when he walked on this earth. And we are called always, always to root our mission of healing and conversion in the lived experience of those whom we love as our sisters and brothers in Christ. It is frequently said by those who have opposed elements to the pastoral mission of Pope Francis that the doctrine cannot be superseded by the pastoral. It is equally important to recognize that the pastoral cannot be eclipsed by doctrine. For the pastoral ministry of Jesus Christ stands at the heart of any balanced understanding of the church that we are called to be. And pastoral authenticity is as important as philosophical authenticity or authenticity in law in contouring the life of the church to the charter which our Lord himself has given to us. Thank you very much.
What would you advise us priests when we have bishops who are so contrary to what you have just described? What do we do?
Well, there are a couple of things. One is the pastoral theology that I'm trying to outline, that I think really is what Francis is calling us to, is not a pastoral theology which is the possession of the bishops. It is a pastoral theology which is a possession of the whole church. And thus all of us are called to live that out, to reflect upon it, to deepen it. And so that when you ask, where does the pastoral action in the life of a diocese go on? You know, I don't think anybody here would answer, and I say this having worked in chanceries a long time, I don't think anybody would say it's primarily in the chancery office. You know, the pastoral work is embedded with the life of the people and in the life of the people. We all know that we became priests to serve the life of the church and to serve people in the church. But we know that the great bulk of the pastoral theology I'm talking about, lived reality and reflected reality, takes place in the lives of lay people in our parishes. And so what I'd say is, yes, I understand the dilemma you're raising, but this is an orientation of how we live as church, I believe, this notion of pastoral, the pastoral moment. And that is an orientation which begins in the hearts of everybody who's in the life of the church. And you know, we talked too about the Lamentations earlier. Those are things where we need to be ministered to pastorally too. We are both recipients and we are givers of pastoral action. And so I don't think it's something that's primarily that takes place in discussions among bishops or statements by bishops. I don't think that's where the heart of it is. So that's my fundamental answer. Now, I do think, in terms of how the church speaks about this at various levels, yes, then there's an impact on that. But what I'm trying to point to even within that universe is this. It annoys me when people say about something that the Pope will say, well, that's just a pastoral approach, and that should not interfere with the philosophical integrity or the legal integrity. The pastoral cannot be secondary. Okay? It has to be at the heart of the ecclesiological, theological enterprise and the work of the church and who the church is. And that's where, you may have seen, I went and looked online when I was preparing this. People talk about the Second Vatican Council and say it was only a pastoral council. You hear that a million times? I think we should say it was a pastoral council. Isn't that great? That's a claim. That's a claim for us. That's a wonderful thing it was a pastoral council. It was a certain type of council. It was not a doctrinal council. It was a pastoral council. We needed a pastoral council at that moment. So we shouldn't look on that as secondary, although the people saying it mean it in that sense. But we should never take that and say, oh, that means it was just a lesser council. It isn't. It was a momentous event in the life of the church, and what we needed was pastoral in nature. And thus, I think we, on this wider level, beyond the pastoral for each one of us, on the wider level in the life of the church, we have to understand, pastoral is not a diminutive term.
Thank you, Bishop, for the talk. It's excellent. We especially enjoyed the sequence of Christ's pastoral theology: embrace, heal, call. Question: is there a role in pastoral theology for confrontation and speaking truth to power? And how is that done in the context of embrace, heal, call, if it can?
Sure. You're talking about within the life of the church or within the life of society, or? Okay. I think there is. I think we're in the middle. For example, I'm going to just cite in our society today, the discussion going on over the throwing out of Sarah Saunders from that restaurant, okay? I think that's bad, okay? I think, and I think what Maxine Waters said about it is bad. That doesn't mean that the president's statements are not terrible in terms of the way they treat people, but it means that we can't let ourselves succumb to that. And so I think it's precisely in a moment when you're talking about speaking truth to power that we must most reflect Christ's manner, okay? Because it's hardest to do. And sometimes we think, oh, it's less effective, okay? But it's at the heart of who we seek to be in this world and how we seek to transform this world. And I think for us as a country, or us as a church, or us as an individual in parish life, the same thing. Once we cross the barrier of purposely and intentionally bracketing our effort to mimic Christ, in the good sense, mimic Christ, and say, in this case, I'm going to not mimic Christ specifically, I think we do a disservice to our role in the life of the church. It doesn't mean it's easy, and it doesn't mean the language always has to be the same, but it means there has to be that care always there, and civility, I think.
Thank you, Bishop, very much for your comments. Our table reflected on how might we deal with the cultural phenomenon of the purportedly Catholic forces such as EWTN, the Register, Church Militant, and even in our own congregations when we preach social justice, and the response is, I don't come here for that, I come here to improve my relationship with Jesus, or whatever. We understand what the disconnect is, but using your formula, embrace, heal, confront, or change, call to change, how might we apply that, especially when our blood pressure is up about 75 decibels?
I know this. I have to say, it's when I was a pastor, it was more difficult. Bishops kind of get a pass on this because people figure, oh, that's their responsibility to talk about these things. It's harder when you're a pastor in the parish because you know the people, and you know when you get up and say certain things, you're alienating them. And yet, that's part of our call of priesthood. And I used to talk to the young priests in our region in Northern California, the newly ordained, about this question. They did not like giving because they didn't like the blowback, personally, but also it divides the congregation. And so I think precisely this methodology of embrace first, because it's really it's not the embrace of the pastor or the head of the worship committee or whoever's involved in dealing with this question. It is the embrace of God we're trying to signal. And so I think that we just point to those areas in the gospel which are so manifest and multiple, where Jesus speaks to these issues of the poor. It's hard to read Matthew without understanding that this is a pretty strong and categorical command. But to speak about that, and to speak about it in ways that are embracing, and to try to avoid getting hurt. We all get hurt by things that go on. I have to say, when I give certain talks, I go back the next day into the office. I get so many calls, negative, so that I now buy flowers for the receptionists who have to answer the phone. And I come in the morning with bouquets, and they'll say, "What did you do now?" So anyway. And I'm lucky on that in that I wrote academically for a while, so you're used to blowback and stuff. It is hard, but I do think that is a real challenge to us to speak the truth, but to do it lovingly, and to understand that when people aren't seeing it as we see it, we keep speaking the truth. And even when they're attacking us, it's hard. It's really hard, I understand. It's harder for you in parishes than it is for me. I know that. I was a pastor for 15 years in the same place, and I know that. It is hard. And even then, I would shy away from things. But it is, I think, if we sacrifice who we are, in terms of our manner of doing it. Now, I do think there's an important question that has to be asked of groups like EWTN and so forth, and that is, it's simply clear that on certain issues they are in dissent from the papal magisterium, and we have to say that. And not that not that the ministry they do is thus corrupted or thus negated. All of us who have parishioners know that so many of them have found great spiritual sustenance there. But we do have to underscore that when you dissent from the Pope, you're dissenting from the Pope. And from papal teaching on this. And going back to Matthew, from the gospel and the Lord himself on certain things. So,
Bishop, thank you for being with us and sharing. And we appreciate you talking about the pastoral dimension. We were talking about here at this table, relation to dogma and to practices. The priest there asked you about the struggle when the bishops don't seem to be, and you said, well, it's not there. Well, let me give you an example where I think it is there and we're struggling with it. This organization, a few years ago, tried to appeal to the bishops to do something about the translation of the Mass, the way we celebrate pastorally with our people. We've continually tried to, and most recently with Magnum Principium out there, we've asked Archbishop Wilton Gregory, whom I know personally, why don't you stop these translations that are using the old thing? We've not heard back from him. Some others have written. That is pastoral. Are we supposed to, as priests, simply disregard what has been approved and do what we believe is pastorally, or will you and others try to get the bishops to say, let's deal with this very real pastoral situation that's affecting people?
But when the Pope clarified the situation recently, it came up the very next meeting. My priest council brought it up. So he said, how soon are they going to change it back? And I said, now realistically, I don't think they're going to change it back. Now, a lot of bishops, as you know, opposed this. This did not get majorities. You needed a 2/3 majority. It didn't get it on the first go-rounds. And Rome finally said, the Congregation of Bishops finally said, more or less, you got to do this. So they did it. But there's not great enthusiasm among the bishops. Now, it's divided. It's divided. Some bishops really like the new one. Even I don't like the new one. However, even I'm put in a bind as to, do I think it's better to unlearn what we did? I'm talking about the Mass. To me, the Mass is the key one, because it affects so many people, and so should we undo it is the question. And I kind of felt we should undo the priest parts because they can unlearn it more easily, but it's harder to undo the people's parts once we've had them learn it. I don't know what the right answer is on that, even though I did not like the translation, and the priests I know overwhelmingly have not liked it. Okay, I just don't know what is the best thing pastoral. I'm talking about pastoral. I'm trying to think of this. Do we go back and say, now relearn this stuff the other way? And so I don't know, but no, we can. But remember, you get to what does that communicate to the people, and then they have to unlearn the stuff again. I had to confess, I still find it very hard. I need the card. It's bad. It's bad. Because once you've learned something, it's really, and it's changed in minor ways. If it were a whole new prayer, I'd be okay now. But I'm still not there. I don't know if I'm alone in that, but I still find it, so anyway. Well, and I don't think the mistake part is so much the impediment as pastorally, is it better to undo it, to unlearn it? I don't. Because even I, who didn't like the original decision, I don't know if it's better pastorally to go back or not. I asked our priests. Now, and they did not like our former bishop, Bishop Brahm, hates the new translation, has made it his life work to try to accomplish the reversal. And so our guys do not favor it in general. There are some beautiful things. I'll tell you, there's certain ones like the light of your face, in the Eucharistic prayer. That's a beautiful thing. I'd like to edit it and take some good things. It's just the ablative absolute is a clunky thing in English, and that's, I think, our big problem.
I have a question, Bishop. Bishop over here.
Oh, sure.
There's a woman who was a classmate of mine in grammar school, and anyway, she became a wonderful Catholic. She was a daily communicant and very prayerful. And this happened some years ago. She went to confession. She had 9 children, had been following the law, obviously. She had 9 children, and she went to confession, and she asked her pastor, if she could have permission to practice birth control, and mentioned that she had 9 children. Well, he got infuriated, bawled her out, told her that was a terrible thing for her to come and request, and if she ever came back in there again and asked that same thing, I don't know what he would do. But anyway, so he didn't give her absolution, he sent her out, and she never returned to church again, of course, and she was a daily communicant. My question is this: isn't it part of pastoral theology to teach people the rights of conscience? Seems like the official church has been very hesitant to teach people about conscience. Now, I know that some people think that conscience is to help us better understand the teachings of the church so that we can follow the teachings of the church. But conscience is more than that, and gives us the right, if there's a disagreement, to follow what we honestly feel God is calling us to. I'm talking about a well-formed conscience now. It seems like lay people have the right to know that, and to know the rights of conscience, so that if they get into a situation like that, and if they feel like they've done everything they possibly could do by having 9 children, that they have the right to follow their conscience if that's the way they feel God is leading them. And I think it's part of pastoral theology to make sure that lay people know that they have a right to follow their conscience.
I absolutely agree. It was interesting. We had in San Diego a diocesan synod on Amoris after Amoris. And so each parish sent a representative. We had certain other groups represented as delegates. And then they divided into various working groups. One of them was dealing with the question of Chapter 8, but much more profoundly than just the communion question, was dealing with the question of conscience. Let me say that working group, which was the synod delegates were overwhelmingly lay people. They were blown away. We had theologians for each working committee who would give input. They were blown away by the church's theology of conscience. And they said, we've never been taught this effectively. And these were very involved lay people, very faithful to the life of the church. They weren't looking for a get-out-of-jail-free card. They weren't. They were looking for an adult way of decision-making in those excruciating situations where you find yourself in conflict and trying to understand, what is God calling me to do? And that's what the conscience is called us to do. Jim Keenan, who's a professor at BC, he has a very good article on conscience. And what he says is that the deepening of the church's theology of conscience, which came out of Europe after World War II, came in this way. He said it wasn't a get-out-of-jail-free card. It wasn't to loosen standards. What it was the moral theologians in Europe got together after the war, and they said, how could it have been that people followed the law in the Third Reich? And they concluded that one of the key elements, they didn't have a sense of developed conscience. That it was precisely that's what was lacking. It's that deep sense of conscience which we have to educate our people on. And actually, one of our synodal outcomes was the people felt very strongly that we need to educate people in an adult way on conscience as a help to them in their lives. Obviously, it's not something you use for everyday decisions. Conscience is particularly, that deep level of conscience is made for when you come on a situation which is difficult to figure it out. And thus a sense of conscience that is profound and rooted in God is a great gift to give to people. It's not a, in my view, the great enemy of the Christian moral life is rationalization, when we convince ourselves that what's best for us is also the right thing to do. I remember with my mother when I used to say I was going to do something and she'd know I was leaning in that direction, it wasn't the right. She'd say this awful, what would Jesus do, And I didn't always know what Jesus would do, but I knew it was darn well not what I was going to do. So rationalization is a big problem in conscience, and we have to keep that as part of it. But conscience is a great gift to give to people.
I have a question with regard to, you mentioned about being non-judgmental. And one of the reasons why our young people leave the church is they see the church as very judgmental. And how do we stand up for our standards? You know, we got the commandments, we got the Beatitudes, we got the parables and all that. How do we stand for that and yet not be seen as judgmental? I think it's a real problem in today's world.
I think there are two issues that come into play here. One is, how do we regard it when people fail? Okay. All of us fail. All of us fail dramatically in our lives. All of us fail in different areas of life. You know, we're called, the Pope says in this recent one, we're called to be saints. But each one, I think one of the beautiful things of it, he says, each one of us is called to be saints in our own way. Because each one of us has certain strengths that we can live out beautifully in the world and ennoble the world by our being here. And so I think it's important that how we communicate what a failure is, what a sin is, and what it means. It doesn't mean we reject people. I think that's a key thing, that how we communicate inclusion and communicate the fact that all of us fail. The second thing is, I think we too much concentrate on sexual sins. I think that's a great problem. And thus, that is not the heart of the Christian moral life. It's one of the virtues. Chastity is an important virtue. It's not the primary virtue. Right? We're called to follow the virtues of Jesus Christ, of mercy and compassion and integrity and courage and honesty and forgiveness, all of these virtues of Christ. Chastity is one of the virtues. We're called to call it. It's not the most important one. And very often as it gets articulated, the stress is put on that as the primary one. I think that's a disservice in the life of the church. And I think that's what drives away so many young people.